writer Daniel Defoe wrote a book called The Diary of the Plague Year, about the year 1665. He was about 4 when the plague happened, but the book he wrote vilifies the victims of the plague. He basically says that the people in London were so corrupt and so degenerate, the plague was almost deserved by the people of London. There was an attempt by the Whigs and the Tories in the early 19th century, 1800s, to paper over the cracks and bury this story. And that's the history we get taught now.
Do you want to go into the plague then, now that we've mentioned it?
Sure. I mean, this is very, very weird, but true. I can tell you 2 things that are absolutely true that I very much doubt you'll have heard before. One is that there was a way of not getting plague. You could keep yourself safe. And that had been known about for hundreds of years, and that was nutmeg. Nutmeg, when you eat it, means no insect will bite you. And it is the reason why nutmeg was the most expensive commodity in the world at that time, because everyone in the know, including, the aristocracy and so on, everyone knew that if you had nutmeg, you didn't get plague. That made it a very, very, very valuable commodity. Now, in 1664, we started an unprovoked war against the Dutch, and the Dutch had a monopoly on nutmeg. We stole all the Dutch nutmeg and brought it back. I say we, the Royal Navy stole the Dutch nutmeg and brought it back to London. Samuel Pepys, who worked for the Navy, records in his diary that they all made a fortune that year because they pirated so much Dutch shipping. Tons of nutmeg were one of the things that they stole. Now, at the same time, let's say, or around that era, the Christopher Wren's best friend, Robert Hooke, had been conducting an incredibly detailed study of fleas. He kept fleas, I guess, probably at the Royal Society. I don't think you keep them at home. And he produced this picture of a flea that was published in his book Micrographia in 1665. You'll see that this is an incredibly detailed picture of the flea. He writes about it in incredible detail in the book. Robert Hooke was the biggest expert in fleas in the world at the time when the plague hit London. The plague that hit London is unlike any other major outbreak of plague in the history of the bubonic plague. There are epidemiologists who have looked at this, and there's a chain of events that happens. There's a boom and bust in the rat population in the sort of Central Asia. As the rats die off, the fleas look for new hosts, so they jump to humans because they've got no one else to feed off. And you can see there's a chain of transmission that epidemiologists can trace in every major outbreak of the plague. It starts in the Middle East, sort of goes up through Italy, up into southern France, through France, up to Holland and Belgium, and then over the Channel to England, all by boat. But there's a chain of transmission. Now, in 1665, nowhere else had been hit by plague on a scale anything like this. So people at the time were saying, well, this is strange, because normally, we'd have heard about the plague coming through Italy, through France. We'd have heard about it. But no, it's only landed in London. And epidemiologists say they cannot explain how that happened. But people who hated the city of London had become expert in fleas and had loads of nutmeg. Now, I can't tell you exactly what happened, but again, the situation was very well managed. John Graunt, the man who had turned off the water to London on the night of the fire, was responsible for keeping what were called the records of deaths in London. The different parishes would record how many people had died in each area and what of. And you collected those bills of mortality together, John Graunt, and was able to assess, therefore, how bad the plague was in different areas. It was John Graunt's advice to the wealthy that they move out of London when the plague hit. Once it hit a certain number of deaths per parish, he said, oh, now's the time to leave. It was his advice, once the death numbers had come down again, to say, yeah, now it's safe to come back. John Graunt had set up this system of monitoring deaths a few years prior, and was instrumental in collating the number of deaths and keeping the records during the plague. So you have some people who are all very close to one another, involved in a number of ways in these different incidents. Robert Hooke, who drew the flea, also helped measure London after the fire. John Graunt who turned off the water to London, helped keep a tally on the plague deaths before the fire. Christopher Wren was best friends with both of them. Also say, very interestingly, a lady called Lisa Jardine was an expert on Wren, is of the opinion that this picture of the flea is actually not by Hooke, because if you look at a lot of Hooke's pictures, they're good, but they're not this good. She thinks that this and a couple of other pictures in Hooke's book, Micrographia, was actually drawn by Christopher Wren, who was, by all accounts, an absolutely amazing draftsman. So somehow or another, Hooke and maybe Wren had got these fleas, bred them, learnt about their life cycles, learnt about what they like to eat, learnt everything they could about fleas, and drew incredibly detailed images of them.
The Navy goes and gets all of the nutmeg, brings it back to England, and then they suspiciously have a giant plague outbreak, like you say, that's focused on London. There isn't a path coming from Europe that you'd expect to see in the ports moving over, and it's just decimated London. And the people again seem to have had an idea of it before it's happened. And the same group of people that have been involved in the fire.
It's a very small circle of people. You know, if you were up to this sort of thing, I imagine you'd want to know each other very well and trust each other an awful lot. But it just seems some remarkable coincidences. Well, I'd heard of John Graunt because of these bills of mortality. When I read the Bishop of Salisbury saying it was John Graunt who turned off the water to London, what are the chances of that? What are the chances of that? I mean, I got unlucky in two massive disasters. I just so happened to be there with his mate Christopher Wren as the building's burning, going, "Look, I've got a new plan for the." I mean, it doesn't bear scrutiny, and it's taken. I've read around this era an awful lot, and whenever you come across someone who was actually there, they're really clear that some weird stuff was going on. These weren't a natural series of events at all. So I can't tell you exactly what happened with regard to the plague, but I can tell you there's some incredible coincidences. Another one was that Robert Hooke suggested to the Lord Mayor of London that because as the plague hit, that they should kill all the cats and dogs in the city because cats and dogs might be the things spreading the plague. Well, as we know now, if you kill all the cats and dogs, that means there's nothing to catch the rats that really are spreading the plague. Robert Hooke, or his best mate Wren, drew a beautiful image of a flea, knew all about the fleas, and then suggested to the Mayor of London that because once the plague had hit, that they kill all the cats and dogs, and this would have meant, meant party time for the rats who were actually spreading it. Again, John Graunt, who turned off the water before the fire, was there during the plague, keeping an eye on how many people were dying where. These are all things that definitely did happen. You have to really wonder about the kind of people who would spread a pathogen like that.
Probably the same type of people that burned down a city.
Yeah, I guess you could, but yeah, it's kind of hard to fathom, though, isn't it? I mean, Hooke was a madman. I mean, a dangerous madman. Here's another interesting thing about Hooke. I mean, he pretty much was the first professional scientist in England. He got employed by the Royal Society to do loads of experiments and this, that, and the other. But then when Isaac Newton took over the Royal Society, Isaac Newton had Hooke's portrait burnt. Now, your portrait is obviously quite a big deal. It's your way of being remembered. And Isaac Newton wanted to destroy Robert Hooke's image, his memory.
For some reason, Newton really hated him.
Yeah, yes. And people say it was to do with gravity or to do with this, that, and the other. Newton did famously say, if I've seen further, it's because I've stood on the shoulders of giants. And Robert Hooke took that personally because Robert Hooke was about 5 foot tall. There was a good deal of animosity between the two. But it's unprecedented to burn someone's portrait. And you've got to figure out Isaac Newton he must have known what he was doing.
Even Isaac Newton was not beyond making midget jokes,
Yeah, well, I think, exactly. I mean, they're there for the taking, aren't they? Robert Hooke was a horrible person. He took a huge amount of opium. He experimented on himself with drugs all the time. There's an hilarious quote from him about taking cannabis. I mean, he was a very, very, very keen self-medicator. Not at all a reliable person, died fairly young and very cranky, and was just, I think, the archetypal mad scientist. Some of the quotes from Hooke are just batshit crazy. Writing about cannabis. The dose of it is about as much as to fill a common tobacco pipe. The leaves and seeds being dried first and pretty finely powdered, this powder being chewed and swallowed or washed down by a small cup of water doth in a short time quite take away the memory and understanding, so that the patient understands not, nor remembereth anything that he sees, heareth, or does. And in an ecstasy, but becomes, as it were, a mere natural, being unable to speak a word of sense, yet he is very merry, and laughs, and sings, and speaks words without any coherence, not knowing what he saith or doeth. Yet he is not giddy or drunk, but walks and dances, and shows many odd tricks. After a little time he falls asleep, and sleeps very soundly and quietly, and when he wakes up he finds himself mightily refreshed and exceedingly hungry.
I mean, why would he say about the leaves and seeds? That just sounds like he doesn't really know what he's talking about there.
Yeah, no, that was him talking to the Royal Society. That was his official report into taking an electrory of cannabis, of bang, which I think was a form of hash.
Wow. I wonder if he was trying to give it a bad image, saying like, oh, they don't remember anything. They just...
He was actually of the opinion that taking drugs made you more like God.
Fair enough.
Yeah, well,
You heard it here first, folks. Taking drugs gets you closer to God.
He had a thing that, something like by use of art and experiment, and by using certain techniques, he could think in godlike terms. He really did enjoy getting high, I think it's fair to say. I mean, he did some remarkable things. He's a famous scientist, but he also made a very, very detailed study of the flea, knew all about its life cycles, its preferences, its ecology, you could say. And he did all that all in the run-up to the 1665 plague, which didn't hit anywhere else. It's very, very, very strange and slightly scary. Mad scientist who had his portrait burned by Isaac Newton.
I'm struggling to think what drug you take, where you're like, I'm going to make a plague.
Well, I'm glad I've never had any, because I have to say, there's stuff in Hook's diary about Christopher Wren being very sick for a few days after him experimenting with whatever he was experimenting with. They call them electrories or whatever, just medicine they decided to take because they fancied it. And they had some quite spice. I mean, cocaine had come over with the Stuarts. The Stuarts were very keen on cocaine. Opium was available, hash was available. There were all kinds of different concoctions available. And they were gentlemen, and they thought, well, I know what I'm doing. I'll have some of this, and then I'll have some of that. And there's some bits in Hook's diary that are mental, because it's just like, I had some of this and it made me feel like that. So I had some of that made me feel like this. And then I fell asleep and I woke up and I shat myself.
Which one of their friends, I think it's one of their friends, is the one that took a shit on a crowd of people or something off a balcony?
Well, that was Lord Sedley. This is all written down in his diary. But what's definitely true is the Stuarts, while they were in exile, they got friendly with the Spanish and fought actually the English army on the side of the Spanish on the continent. And they got friendly with Spanish officers, and Spanish officers had found cocaine to be useful on the battlefield, right? Makes everything better, I guess. So they came back to London and brought cocaine with them. Now, Lord Sedley was one of Charles II's sort of best mates. He was apparently a very witty man, he wrote some poetry and all that sort of thing. He was an aristocrat with a good sense of humour. Now, for whatever reason, one day, I think it was called the Cock Inn on the Strand, which is a major road in London, stood out on the balcony, bollock naked, and started making a sermon to all the people below him. Started going on about how this was great, how that was great. At one point, he washed his dick in his wine and saluted the king to it. Saluted the king, and he also said, this is the quote that stands out, that he had such a powder on him. It had such a powder on him that would make all the cunts in London run after him. He then to sort of as a sort of punctuation mark on his little sermon, he shat all over the people below. Now, he was fined 500 quid for breach of the peace or whatever, and Charles II paid that £500 fine. Lord Sedley said to have remarked he thought it was the first man who had ever had to pay for shitting.
Wow.
So he had quite an attitude to him. So that's Lord Sedley, one of Charles II's sort of friends. They partied like there was no tomorrow. Charles II's court was known for being very debauched and hedonistic and all that sort of thing. Oh.
I had no idea that they were so bad, but you can see it, can't you? You can see it.
Well, they've got nothing to do, have they? I mean, you're king. You get £1 million a year income, whatever. You've got all the nice places to live in. Everyone's being a sycophant. What are you going to do? He ended up having like 15 illegitimate kids and dying young because he just partied too hard.
Imagine living in the 17th century, though. Your coke dealer would have been Lord Sedley.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it would have been illegal at that time. So if you'd known the right apothecary, you could have just popped along and, I guess, bought it off the shelves. But Robert Hooke, when the first boatload of bang, the first boatload of hashish turned up, he befriended the captain and they spent about a month together.
That's actually really funny.
Yeah, I know. Like, ate a lot of bad food and, probably watched some shit on Netflix and then got on with life after.
Disappeared for a month and nobody saw him.
They smoked a boat's worth of hash. Yeah, so they were quite an exotic bunch. I mean, it's not this whole idea that everyone back then was very prim and proper is just not true at all. People like to have a good time. Robert Hooke being someone who really liked to have a good time. Like I say, some of his diary entries are mad because he'd literally try one thing in the morning, it made him feel all ill, so he'd try something else that would make him feel something else. And his diary is just a list of all the things, the drugs he was taking, trying to sort his head out. This is Robert Hooke just saying, took spirit of Sal almanac with small beer at supper, very feverish all night but slept well, strangely refreshed in the morning by drinking Sal almanac again with small beer and sleeping after it, purged me twice, and this is a new great discovery in medicine. So basically he's taking stuff that making him so ill he's vomiting, and then he's saying how well it's making.
Yeah, I've only heard purge before when they talk about, in ayahuasca ceremonies, they go to Peru and this will make you shit yourself for 5 hours and then you meet God.
I think he skipped the meeting God bit and just went to the shitting himself. Took a volatile spirit of wormwood which made me very sick and disturbed me all night and purged me in the morning. Drank small beer and spirit of Sal almanac, purged me 5 or 6 times very easily Sunday morning. This is certainly a great discovery in physics. I hope that this will dissolve that vicious slime that has so much tormented me in my stomach and guts.
Yeah, he thinks he has a slime in his stomach and he is just looking around the room like, can I take this?
George's marvelous medicine gone mad. I mean, he was a danger to himself. He was a danger to other people. He loved his opium.
He helped orchestrate a plague, probably.
Something to do on the weekend, isn't it? I guess, I don't know. I mean, if the history again, Robert Hooke was pretty much written out of our history. You don't find much mention of him until the last 40 or 50 years. Specifically, a lady called Lisa Jardine kind of brought him back and even claimed she found the portrait that Newton had burnt, but it turned out that wasn't that portrait, and that portrait was burnt. So Robert Hooke goes down in history as being the man who was the only man in the history of the Royal Society who's had his portrait burnt. For whatever reason, Isaac Newton didn't like him.
And it's interesting, you talked about the nutmeg. When I was looking into the nutmeg, because I wanted to find out when we actually found it. Apparently, the Romans were purchasing or importing 3.5 million pounds of nutmeg a year from Egypt at one point.
Okay, I didn't know that. What I understood was that the nutmeg that was around at the time I'm talking about only was found on a few islands in Indonesia. They're called
the Egypt presumably were getting it from there and then selling it.
Oh, I get
they think that they were getting it from Chinese traders that were in the Moluccas Islands, which is where Bandas is, in that area of Indonesia.
Growing in Egypt, I had no idea.
No, I don't think it was. No, but they were importing 3.5 million pounds, which is obviously a lot. So the Egyptians must have had a spice trade going to the same areas. So there's loads of people will have had this spice trade, and it's like we talked about yesterday on the phone. The Mongols. The Mongols were the ones that literally turned this into a biological warfare. They would fire they catapult body parts or feces into cities and then sit there and go, right, give that 10 minutes. And that was like one of the things that they used to do. They'd use the Silk Road. They figured out that they could actually keep the virus almost incubated for the journey of the Silk Road by grabbing somebody who's infected and riding him as fast as they can. They realized, we can actually get it to the end of Silk Road. So they
disease-a-roo or something like that.
Yeah, basically, they figured out, we can get it all the way from one end of the Silk Road to the other without the infection dying, and then we can pass that infection on to whoever we want. So they could literally, there's cases in America, isn't there, of groups going into Native Americans, catching them, bringing them, making them hang out with people that have like smallpox, and then sending them straight back in and then go and watch the damage.
No. You just reminded me, and thank you. Christopher Wren was a director of the Massachusetts Bay Company, and they infamously gave Native Americans from around their blankets, and those blankets have been used by people who had been suffering from smallpox. So that when they gave these blankets to these Native Americans who had no natural immunity, it decimated them.
So it's Wren again.
Well, that's a business associated with Wren, or Wren was made rich by being a director of it.
But I genuinely think that around the 15 to 1600s, it became Europe's #1 tactic to deal with anything. Just go and give them a virus.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you look at how humans treat humans today. I mean, it's horrible, but it's not beyond the realms of possibility, is it? And
well, the way we've got it down, isn't it, that it's an accident where you say, oh, because we've never seen the South Americans, they have no immunity to our diseases. So the minute that the Europeans turned up and coughed, they died.
Obviously, I mean, once someone worked out that they didn't have immunity to smallpox, you'd hope that they'd try and think of a way of vaccinating them, not giving them the disease and killing them. Do you know what I mean? But I was
just going to say that even in the Arabic days, I remember seeing they actually have the mental hospitals where obviously the patients, whether they're mental or not, is irrelevant, but they'd just be giving you, whatever drugs, just give them, see what happens. The ancient Chinese were doing this. They were in the pursuit of philosopher's stone, turn anything to gold, kind of, they were in the pursuit of that. And at one point particularly around the 600 to 800 AD, they were trying anything they could get their hands on, mixing it together, going, what does that do? That's how they found gunpowder. They were like, oh, this one sets on fire. And it's nuts to think how much of that was going on without them having any idea about keeping stuff contained. They were putting people in essentially Petri dishes, handing them loads of stuff, and then going, let's see what happens.
Let's see what. Yeah, exactly. But I mean, there was a very famous Chinese doctor who paid good money to meet people who've been shot in the head by an arrow, because different kinds of brain damage. It wasn't long before people were finding people they didn't like, just shooting him in the head with an arrow and then selling it for a price.
That reminds me of the snakes story. Is it in India when they wanted to get rid of all the snakes in India? So they said, we'll pay for snakes. So obviously people just started breeding snakes.
Yes.
They increased the population of snakes. And then when they said, right, we're not going to pay you any more money for these snakes, they all released them into the wild. So now there's even more snakes than there were before.
Was that the British?
Damn it.
Yeah.
The British thought, I know how to sort this out. Bit of capitalism, but
it's our answer to everything, right?
This is on the plague that we can bring up. How New York was traded with the Dutch.
Oh yeah, okay. So the war being fought between England and the Dutch was the Second Anglo-Dutch War, 1665 to 1667. At that time, England had laid claim to one of the Banda Islands in now Indonesia, where the nutmeg came from. And what we did when we signed a peace treaty with the Dutch was we agreed to give up our Spice Island in the Banda Islands in exchange for Manhattan Island, what was called at the time New Amsterdam. James, Duke of York, decided to rename New Amsterdam New York after himself as Duke of York. And it was really then that he was able to use his new Royal Africa Company to import slaves into America, because it was illegal to have slaves in England, but they'd worked it out so that in the colonies in America it was possible to have slaves. So the Dutch gave up Manhattan, gave up New York for nutmeg, and some people go, oh, isn't that funny? It's a bit of a trope. Oh, the Dutch are so stupid, they gave up all of Manhattan for the nutmeg trade. But no one understands, of course, that nutmeg saved you from plague and was the most valuable commodity in the world. It was more valuable by weight than gold. That's why the Dutch gave up Manhattan. Just in summary, the year 1665 to 1666, the poet laureate at the time, Daniel Dryden, called it the Year of Miracles. And a series of events happened that had no precedent in history. Nothing like them's ever happened before or since. And really, you just got to ask yourself, I mean, do you believe in miracles? Because if you don't believe in miracles, then there has to be some kind of explanation for why all these disasters happened. And the fact that it was all meant to be, or at least the fire was meant to be, an accident, and then you go to the official parliamentary report into the fire and it states that the fire was arson, you've got to ask yourself what's going on, because we're not being told the truth about our own history. And it's really quite amazing that a country, I don't know any other country's history as well as I know Britain's history. But our history is a pack of lies. This was manifestly arson. The Great Fire of London was arson, according to all the credible witnesses there at the time. And yet we get told when we're 5, oh, it all happened by accident. It blows my mind that we live in a country that treats its subjects with so little respect. I mean, we literally get lied to on our first day of school. And I still find it hard to believe that it's true, but it is true. Everyone there at the time, all the credible witnesses.
Definitely say that the fleas and the fire seem like they're part of one big attack on London, orchestrated by Wren and his boys.
Thank you. Yeah, in revenge for the City of London being the force behind the Civil War, they wanted to bring the City of London to its knees.
And I suppose as well, the City of London represented one of the biggest power obstacles, for them. If somebody's standing up to you like that and has the power to, like you say, lock the gates on the king, they can't be having that. So they probably really thought, we need to take this city down and reconstruct it so that we are the ones in charge, not these guys anymore.
Yeah, the king wasn't technically allowed to come into the City of London without permission. That goes back to at least the Magna Carta. So the City of London had privileges, and it was incredibly wealthy. When Charles I really annoyed them and tried to damage business, they were just too rich and powerful. The bankers, the traders, they were all just too rich and powerful. They bought an army, they bought the equipment, and they laid waste to the royalists. And the royalists were in shock because suddenly all these merchants, all these people involved in trade, had kicked them off the throne. So they were very motivated to bring the city down, and ultimately they failed. And ultimately, the City of London created the biggest empire the world's ever seen, which is the British Empire, and spread capitalism. And now we all get to live in the 6th mass extinction event because capitalism's fucking everything. And that all started.
I'm glad that's your opinion. I'm very anti-capitalist.
Well, I mean, that is history. That's what's happened. The British Empire went around and just butchered and commodified everything. And that all started 1666. This is the sort of turning point, a very, very, very pivotal moment in British history. Therefore, it became world history.
And you talk as well, don't you, about how Britain essentially robbed India of its wealth. It went in, they controlled something like 20% of the global economy. And by the time Britain was done with it, there wasn't much left.
Yeah, this is, there's a great book called Inglorious Empire by Indian statesman Shashi Tharoor. It just details, like, India was a very, very prosperous place when England got there, which is why they wanted to take it all. And it's something like, someone did a calculation, I think it was something like 45 trillion pounds in today's money worth of stuff was just robbed, taken out of India. The gold, the spices, anything that, wasn't bolted down in typical capitalist fashion, they stole and brought back to Blighty. So nearly every great house in England is built using money that was earned off the back of slaves, really, or serfs.
And they banned the one of the biggest trades, essentially. Well, they didn't ban it, but they brought in the taxes, didn't they, on the cotton, the Indian looms. They didn't want them.
Mean, this is one thing Shashi Tharoor points out, that one of the major products the East India Company had to sell was, cotton from England, and no one in India They had very, very nice fabrics. Thank you very much. Apparently you could pass a sari through a wedding ring. The cloth and the fabric was so fine. Very, very ancient tradition of incredibly expert weavers. And so the East India Company came along with their rough cotton. Everyone India was like, nah, no thanks. So the East India Company shut down the weavers in Bangladesh. And when the weavers didn't like that, they smashed up the looms to stop them weaving. And when people carried on weaving, the East India Company cut off people's thumbs to stop them weaving. This is what Shashi Tharoor says. The East India Company was a wealth extraction process. They just found places, where there was wealth, they'd take it. Something like 20-25% of the world economy was what India represented when the English got there. It was like less than 5% or something like that when they left. There were less people being able to read. There were less people living as long. Britain impoverished India. They built the railway there, but the railway was actually very, very expensive to build. And the British only built it so that they could move goods and make more of a profit. They didn't really build it for passenger at all. They built it for freight. You could talk about what the East India Company did in China and the Opium Wars. I mean, we don't get taught about that. Every kid in China gets taught about the Opium Wars.
And India has still to this day they've got the loom, don't they, on their flag because of Gandhi telling people to weave their own stuff.
Yeah, homespun.
A protest, wasn't it, against the British rule to say, look, we don't want to pay your taxes, we don't want to be oppressed like this anymore. And the loom is now, like you say, on the flag of India. It's become a national because of what we did to them.
The people who make this cotton all working in factories in shit conditions in the northwest of Britain. The factory workers of Britain are oppressed. They're producing this cotton, and who do you think picks the cotton?
It was over slaves in America, most likely.
Why was Britain so keen on the Confederacy? Because the Confederacy supplied British manufacturing with the cotton it needed to for the factories to export to India. So it was a pretty vicious cycle of trade going on, where slave picked cotton was being exported to early factories, and that was being exported again.
And you brought up China and the Opium Wars. For background on that, at one point the Chinese had to basically say, look, we're shutting our borders because you lot won't stop bringing in your drugs and trying to give it to our people.
Yeah, please stop.
And
England, people addicted to smack, for fuck's sake,
We're going to invade you unless you accept. And they invaded twice. And in the end, the emperor fled into Manchuria, and they got his, I think it was his nephew, who was open to the idea of the opium. And they were like, look, you're emperor now, but let's do our business. And
they did
it's
all the way across India as well, like the different princes and so on. Incredibly corrupting influence. And I think it's a fair symbol of the British Empire. Clive of India, that everyone talks about, died an obese drug addict. I mean, he was just a horrible human being who picked up all kinds of weird proclivities in India, stuffed his face, was up to his eyeballs all the time, and just lived the life of a pig. And that was Clive of India, the guy who did more than anything else to civilize the dark continent. And it's just the hypocrisy. This is the thing. I mean, England, as you must know, we're in a lot of shit at the moment because the people who run our country still think they run the world, and they're mental. It's going to take another 100 years probably for them to realize that they're no longer running an empire. You know what I mean?
Yeah. It really is terrible. I mean, if you look at it, the city of London is probably most of the reason that we are on paper so rich.
Yes.
We don't have any resources really. We don't produce much. All our wealth is fantasy. It's offshore banking is our real wealth to the world is our link to offshore banking, isn't it?
Yes.
We're a doorway for America to slide its money where they don't want to get taxed.
I mean, in the last 30, 40 years, anything that hasn't been screwed to the floor has been sold to mainly sovereign wealth funds out of the Gulf. So, you've got all these members of, the Gulf states who own huge chunks of England and own our water, own our electricity, own, everything. And they don't really care for democracy. They definitely don't think everyone's born equal or anything like that. The Great Fire London and all of that is just a great way of saying to people, look, this is how our country is really run, and we're the wool is kept over our eyes. I mean,
well, people think that it's in the past, don't they? And one example, when we're talking about India, we started that endeavor, in the 1800s. If you even go to Winston Churchill, somebody that's considered a hero, he shouldn't be, but he's considered a hero to our people. If you look at what he actually said about Indians during the famine, because he purposely moved a load of their grain stocks over to Europe, saying, look, we need it for the war. And the Indians were like, yo, if you do that, we're going to die. And he was like, well, fuck you. And he literally said in his diaries, the Indians are a beastly people. It's their own fault that they're in famine because they reproduce like rabbits.
Yes.
And terrible stuff. And that's coming from the prime minister in World War II. So it's only 80 years ago. Our prime minister hated Indian people, and he caused the deaths of millions of them by removing their food supplies.
Yeah. I mean, there are a couple of things that if you look really hard, you can say about Churchill that not horrible, but everything else, he was the worst kind of. He's the kind of person who thinks that they're born into leadership. They've got sort of a divine right to rule. And that's exactly the kind of Eton nonsense that's resulted in all the stuff we're dealing with now. I mean, the whole political economy of England is fucked because we don't, like you say, we don't make anything. The only service we provide, apart from banking, is bonds. We're not a good place to do business. No wonder poverty is on the march. And I would suggest that a lot of that poverty is not by accident, but by design. And
that goes into what you're saying with Thomas Malthus, and that whole theory.
This is a terrible utilitarian way of looking at things. Malthus said if you let people be, they'll just overpopulate the planet. And I think he said, if the population ever hits a billion, it's going to be hell on earth. And
I'd say that's exactly what Churchill was doing in India, wasn't it? He is exactly what he said. It's their own fault. They bred too much. They've caused this famine on themselves. So he felt fine removing all this grain and taking it to Europe because, like you say, well, I'm just helping them out, really, culling the population because otherwise they'll just eat their own supplies. And it's a terrible way to view it.
That'd be the last thing. I mean, he was very clear as well that, he said about Aborigines in Australia, look, he said something like, I make no apologies for the fact that a superior race, a more sophisticated race, went in and wiped them out. It's just the way of the world.
Fucking hell.
I know, and you just think...
You don't see those quotes printed on the mugs with him.
No. Well, I bet you do in Aborigine shops in Australia, though, or something like that, Yeah, I have to say, if you look at, Joris Bonson and his merry band of... I mean, you listen to anything... you don't even have to listen. You can read what he's written. Johnson's an old school English racist. He thinks anyone brown is inferior. Calling ladies wearing a hijab pillar boxes and just the worst kind of person. And that's who runs this country. And that's who thinks they can tell us, all of this happened by accident. And
it's like Boris Johnson's father. He said that the British public and all of people, but British public should be limited to 2 children because of overpopulation. He said that Britain could only manage 15 million people at most, and everyone should be limited to a maximum of 2 children. He's got fucking 7 or 8, and Boris has got another 7 or 8.
They never apply their rules to themselves. I mean, that's the nature.
Oh, well, if I put more of me out into the world, that's a good thing.
You got to hope that I keep reassuring myself that with Boris, we got peak Tory, and it won't get that bad again because it can't.